Welcome to our program on Kardec Radio.
Good afternoon, my Kardec Radio Spiritist friends. This is John DeRosa coming to you once again at 4 o'clock with a reading from the book, The Way, the Truth, and the Life, written by the Spirit Emmanuel and psychographed by Francisco Cantito Xavier. Normally what we do is to say hello and then to read the selected message, then to comment on certain parts of the message. And after that, we normally say a little prayer, as this time in our society, prayer is so very, very, very important to us. And then we also encourage, at the end of the talk, we encourage nourishing your souls even more with Kardec Radio. So let's get started. Today's message is number 93, entitled Christian Joy. The New Testament quote is from John chapter 16, verse 20. It's from Jesus, and he said, but your grief will turn to joy. Then Emmanuel writes, the disciples could not hide their pain and sorrow in the hours that preceded Jesus' death on the cross. They were grief-stricken. As human beings, they could not understand any kind of victory except an earthly one. But with utmost serenity, Jesus encouraged them. His words were, truly, truly, I say unto you, that you will weep and mourn. The world will rejoice and you will grieve, but your grief will turn to joy. Down through the centuries, the gospel has been seen as a source of bad news, a selfless, pure Savior led to the cross, meant for criminals, disbanded disciples, endless persecution, martyrdom, and tears for all followers. However, this heavy burden of sufferings lays the foundations for a higher level of life, replete with peace and joy. Such sufferings represent God's help to the barren land of human hearts. They come as a divine fertilizer for people's sentiments, so that lilies of hope might spring up from contemptible swamps. Troubled rescuers in the areas of politics and science often prescribe repose and pleasure, but the spirit weeps afterwards for an indeterminate length of time in the dark corners of a conscience wounded by morally delinquent attitudes. Christ, however, showing supreme wisdom, taught a natural way to acquire the eternal joys. He demonstrates that satisfying people's desires without awareness and limits in their present state of evolution is like putting dangerous substances in the hands of children. For this reason, he has reserved toil and struggle for his beloved followers, so that they may not get lost in illusion, but rather arrive in the spirit world with a valuable patrimony of solid gains. That is why Christian joy does not entail irresponsible pleasures, but the sublime certainty that all suffering is the road to unending joy. And that concludes what Emmanuel wrote. And of course, Emmanuel always writes so well and with such clarity that many times it doesn't even need an explanation, especially this last paragraph. That is why Christian joy does not entail irresponsible pleasures, but the sublime certainty that all suffering is the road to unending joy. And suffering is what God allows us to have in order to teach us. This is how we are perfected. There is a quote that comes from, I should back up and say that this morning's 6 a.m. prayer that Vanessa Anzalone delivered was taken from chapter 6 of the book Good News. And in, I believe it is, yes, it's the Spiritus magazine, issue number 30, contains this particular Good News chapter, chapter 6. And it's entitled the faithfulness to God is the title of that particular chapter. And what Vanessa talked about, there's so much in that particular chapter about the faithfulness to God. And the main theme is the fact that he delivered these messages to the disciples about the suffering and trials and tribulations that they're going to be going through in going through the preaching and demonstrating the good news. And this is what Emmanuel talks about here, that they were, disciples were, could not hide their pain and sorrow. They were grief-stricken as human beings. They could not understand any kind of victory except an earthly one. And that's probably one of the first things that I wanted to talk about, because when we look at it from a human perspective, a physical body perspective, it's hard for anybody to understand. But when you look at it from the spiritual perspective, which we constantly remind people that we are a spirit first and a physical bodied person second. And that is something that I think we continually battle with throughout our lives until we, reach that moment when we depart and discarnate. Learning to think of ourselves from a spiritual perspective, and when you look at things from a spirit first, it takes on a totally different perspective. And the apostles unfortunately had forgotten some of the first messages and preachings that Christ did were about this faithfulness to God. And that's what that chapter 6 talks about, this faithfulness to God, because our true joy and happiness comes through the suffering and the laboring through all of these challenges of this physical life. Our victory is won for the spiritual plane, because that's where the true Christian joy is. It's not here, although you can certainly enjoy life here on earth. There's no doubt you can do that. However, in the words of in English, I can't remember. I should remember her name. Life is not a vacation here. She coined that phrase, and it's so very, very appropriate. because the challenges present themselves to us all the time, and it's so easy for us to get sidetracked into the so-called pleasures of this earth. So let's go through, and then heavy burden of suffering lays, and then Emmanuel gets into that heavy burden of suffering lays the foundations for a higher level of life, replete with peace and joy. Suffering represents God's way of helping the land of the human heart to grow. It becomes a as he says, a divine fertilizer that springs up and wipes away that not so good stuff it's in our hearts. And then he goes on to talk about troubled rescuers in the area of politics and science. They talk about pleasure, but the spirit, of course, was not really crazy about that because it wounds the conscience. And then he goes on to talk about how Christ, showing supreme wisdom, taught a natural way to acquire eternal joys. He demonstrates that by satisfying. He demonstrates that satisfying, and this is key. He demonstrates that satisfying people's desires without awareness and limits in their present state of evolution is like putting dangerous substances in the hands of children. For this reason, he has reserved the toil and struggle of his beloved followers, so that they may not get lost in illusion, but rather arrive in the spirit world with a valuable patrimony of solid gains. You're going to have to go through struggles, okay? That's just the way it is here on earth at this particular time. We have not gotten to that point where there's relative peace on earth. Eventually, we will get to that point, but that's a few years, a couple decades away. So at this particular time, we'll go back, and as I mentioned earlier, Vanessa had talked about this chapter and what she picked out from this particular chapter. And I did want to mention that this last thing that we read about putting the dangerous substance in the hands of children. When you when people's desires they're not aware, and they don't know the limits, is like putting things in the hands of a child. And giving a child something like candy, sweet candy, a piece of chocolate that's sweetened with sugar, that becomes very, very dangerous to them, because if there's no limits put on the child to indicate that one or two pieces, that's it, the child has no awareness of the fact that eating too much sugar is not a real healthy way to get your nutrition in life. And of course, if you abuse this by making it a chronic thing where you're addicted to the sugar and the chocolate, it can lead to very unpleasant illnesses for your human body. And diabetes being one of the ones that comes to mind right away. So this is one way, of course, that God has allowed us to learn the suffering that comes our way from this particular way of treating the body. And if we don't understand it initially, we certainly will understand it. That's for sure, because it'll keep visiting us over and over again, and that's the problem that we face, because the little sufferings are initially very, very minor, but then they become even more intense when we don't pay attention to the minor little signs that come our way, the ones that we have to struggle with. I wanted to read one of the things that came out of this chapter 6 of the Good News, because it so relates to what Emmanuel wrote here. And this is, again, what Vanessa keyed on was her message was entitled, I believe it was Everything Has a Price. And she talked, and the quote out of chapter 6 from Jesus is, everything in life has a corresponding cost. If you falter in regards to the blessings of sacrifice and joys of work, you must meditate on the price that fidelity to the world demands. Does not pleasure make one pay a high and painful price? How much will the vain and greedy pay in their inner afflictions? What is the price that the world demands from the joker and the liar? Don't you think that the price that the world extracts from those who cling to its joys and riches is enormous? And this is the key to the talk this morning, and this is what this message is talking about from Emmanuel. This price that we have to pay when we overindulge in these pleasures of the world, of certainly eating a piece of candy once or twice a week is not a big deal. But when we abuse it, that's when it becomes an issue, and it can lead to sufferings. We can help people by always looking for the good that you're able to do in a particular day. And this shortchanges our suffering to a certain extent, because we know, yes, we're going out of our way to help somebody, to set aside what we would rather be doing to give us a little bit of relaxation or whatever. But we go out of our way to help somebody. Like one of your neighbors might need a ride to the doctor's office, and it just happens to coincide with something else that you wanted to do that day. But this is how you set that. You set that particular thing, and you move it to another date, and you reassure the person, your neighbor or your friend or a family member, that you're able to help them, to spend an hour or two out of your day picking them up, driving them to the doctor's office, and then being there for them if they need any particular support, and then taking them back home, and maybe helping them with shopping if they need that. This is the type of seeking out the good, and of course, many times the good finds you and presents itself to you in a way that it's very blatant what God has done. He's asked you to carve that path through your particular life, and also through other ways that you have to avert, going down the wrong path. Where sometimes there are spirits in our life that want to divert you, and they'll come up with something that might take you away, like that. As I mentioned earlier, something else that you had to do, or maybe somebody gives you a call from your family and says they need some help right now, but you have to put the other person first, because we all belong to a universal family. One of the other quotes within this chapter 6 in the Good News that relates to here, because we're back again to this last paragraph that Emmanuel wrote. This is why Christian joy does not entail irresponsible pleasures, but the sublime certainty that all suffering is a road to an unending joy. Suffering that we inflict on ourselves, suffering that may have come from a past life issue, Those are all part of the suffering that's given to us. There is as I was saying, another quote from that particular paragraph, and eventually we'll find it. Oh, here it is. And it's how we should think about God. We should not. This was Jesus again in this here, where one of the disciples had talked about one member that he knew that said he understands Christ's words, but it's kind of difficult to follow because there's so many things that we have to do. And Jesus said, it is not everyone who can understand the truth at first. We should take into consideration that the world is full of believers who do not understand the protection of heaven, but only will in the days of peace and triumph, the good times. However, we know about the supreme will. Thus, we should follow its roadmap. We should not think about God as one who grants everything, but as the Father who educates, not as a God who rewards, but as a Father who perfects us. Through this, we understand that our battle for redemption must be persistent and without reprieve. And further on in the chapter, he also talks about Christ, and this is a famous quote: "No one can serve two masters simultaneously. It is foolish to try to live at the same time for the condemnable pleasures on earth and to live for the sublime virtues of heaven." And this is so in line with what Emmanuel has written here. This is the Christian joy, and it does not entail irresponsible pleasures, but the sublime certainty that all suffering is a road to unending joy, getting through that narrow door. And I think we can lay this particular chapter to rest. And I would like to close out and say a little prayer. As we mentioned earlier, this is such a important time to be praying and praying. I know we all pray, but we can always increase that amount of prayer, because as many of you, if not all of you, know, that everything can be made into a prayer. It's just a matter of where we put our heart in what we do for ourselves and what we do for other people. So let us close our eyes and reach up to and reach out, because God is everywhere. Dear Mother, Father, God, Lord Jesus, Mother Mary, and all protector and mentor spirits that be here with us today, thank you for your guidance and protection during this particular time. It is enormously thankful for it and so grateful. We wish to ask for God's infinite love and infinite healing energy to be spread throughout our families, our friends, and our neighbors, and to allow it to expand through our city, our states, and of course, all of the United States and all of the world, to encompass so many people that are suffering from this virus, and to help those that are helping the people with virus, the hospital workers that are there to ensure that people make it through, or at least to comfort those that can't make it through. The food service people, the maintenance people, all the technicians, besides the doctors and nurses. So many people to be thankful for and to pray for in this time. We must also include the people that are in mental institutions, the people that are refugees, the homeless, the hungry, the criminal aspects, and also the suicide, people that are contemplating or have committed suicide. There are so many people that need our prayers. We must continually focus our thought and our hearts towards these people, knowing that God is with all of them, but many of them need to recognize that God never lets them down, but continues to perfect us and educate us. We once again thank you for your guidance and protection during this particular talk. And we ask for your permission to end this particular prayer, and so be it. Thank you, my friends, and I encourage whoever may be watching to continue to spend some time with Kardec Radio. Of course, most of you know it's here 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. There's also a Kardec Radio app. All the programs are filed in Kardec Radio YouTube channel and also in Kardec Radio Facebook page, where many of the live programs are broadcast. We like to say hello to some of the people here that have tuned in. Truth for Satan. No, that's interesting. Leah Smith and Gisela Dutras. And I don't know how to pronounce your last name. Thank you very much for you all watching, and we are signing off. Take care and God bless.